first, I'd like to introduce Jeffrey Horvitz, who has over 45 years of experience as an art dealer and as an art collector. He's also a longtime trustee at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. In the 1970s, he was an art dealer in Los Angeles, specializing in 19th and 20th century American and European art. In the 1980s, he started collecting what became one of the largest and most encyclopedic collections of French drawings, paintings, sculpture, and works produced between 1600 and 1850. For his contributions to French art, he has been honored twice by the French government with official commendations. In the mid-1990s, he and his wife Carol, who's here with us today, turned their eyes to contemporary Japanese ceramics. But first, turned their attention to Chinese imperial cinnabar, and then in 2008, he and Carol turned their attention to contemporary Japanese ceramics and began collecting, those of you that know them, with a furious pace. So that in fact, the collection has grown to such a scale and they are so generous that the collection has been shown in exhibitions, ongoing loans, and through gifts to some 30 museums nationwide. In addition to collecting, Jeffrey has lectured about the art market and collecting strategies at investment conferences. He wrote a chapter about the art market in the book, Collectibles Investing for High Net Worth Collectors, Investor Journal. That was published by Academic Press in 2009. Carol and Jeffrey share a passion for art and the philosophy that they are merely stewards of art in their lifetimes, and that art, like the proverbial Zen tree in the forest, must be seen in order to exist. And to that end, they have placed literally hundreds of thousands of museum visitors across America and Europe have seen their works on loan and as gifts in public collections. Right next to me, sorry, the sensor is over there somewhere. There we go. Is Joan Mervis, who holds a MA in Japanese art history from Columbia University. She is the owner and operator of Joan B. Mervis Ltd. at 78th and Madison, a gallery devoted to Japanese art and specializing in contemporary ceramics, paintings, and ukiyo-e prints. Having participated in more than 100 art and antique fairs across the country since the 1970s, she co-founded what evolved into Asia Week. And in fact, I should mention that this gathering here today is sponsored by Asia Week. In fact, she served as the first chairperson of Asia Week. Amazing. In the area of modern and contemporary Japanese art, she has been a pioneering spirit, I think it's fair to say, and a force behind this burgeoning area of collecting in the West. In 2011, her release of the seminal publication Birds of Dawn, the Pioneers of Japanese Ceramic Sortation Movement, accompanied the groundbreaking exhibition of 80 works assembled over 10 years. More recently, her publication Vessel Explored, Vessel Transformed, Tomimoto Kenkichi and His Enduring Legacy, accompanied a large exhibition of this seminal artist. And just last November, she released The Allure of Japanese Contemporary Ceramics. And by the way, it's here, beautiful copy of it, and she'll be signing books and having a champagne toast in her booth after this presentation, so please plan to join her. She's organized over 80 exhibitions of modern and contemporary Japanese ceramics at her New York gallery and at international fairs, bringing the work of celebrated artists as well as emerging artists to the attention of the American public. And as Helen mentioned, and apropos of our gathering here today, she's participated in the Winter Show for 40 years. You were 12. A little further down the line is James Lally, who has been active in the Chinese art market for over 50 years, beginning as an auctioneer and an executive at Sotheby's in 1970, which was a radical turn of events given his degrees in English literature from Harvard and economics and diplomatic history from Columbia. Jim was the director of Sotheby's Chinese art department in New York and a director of Sotheby's Hong Kong subsidiary from 1974 until 1985. He was made president of Sotheby's in North America in 1984, but he resigned in 1985 when Sotheby's was taken over by Alfred Tallman. following year, he established J.J. Lally and Company, a gallery in the Fuller Building at Madison and 57th, selling Chinese ceramics and works of art, providing advisory services to private collectors and museums. He is renowned for his deep knowledge, connoisseurship, and fine eye, and objects that have gone through his hands now grace the collections of Chinese art at venerable museums worldwide. In the middle is Dessa Goddard. Dessa is Vice President and U.S. Head of Asian Art Group at Bonhams. She oversees all company specialists and consultants in fields of Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Himalayan, Indian, Southeast Asian art in America, and is the Senior North American Chinese Specialist in charge of acquiring consignments for the company's auctions in San Francisco, New York, and Hong Kong. Prior to joining Bonhams, Dessa was a research fellow in Chinese archaeology at the East Asian Art and Culture Research Institute at Tokyo University. She's a graduate of the Inter-University Center for Advanced Japanese in Tokyo, a Stanford University program-based program. And she was an intern in the Paintings and Calligraphy Department at the National Palace Museum in Taipei. She holds a BA in Art History from Northwestern University and worked on a PhD dissertation in early Chinese bronzes at the University of California, Berkeley, before joining the auction field in 1981. She travels and lectures widely throughout the United States on topics in Chinese art and has focused her recent research on the growth of philanthropy and urban culture with a specific eye to the history of Asian collecting in America. She regularly appears on PBS's Antiques Roadshow. And finally, at the very end is Christina Yu, who is the Matsutaro Shoniki Chair of Arts of Asia at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. A noted scholar of Chinese art, she leads a team of curators in overseeing the MFA's collection of more than 100,000 works from East Asia, South and Southeast Asia, and the Islamic world. Together, they develop special exhibitions and publications of Asian art and cultures, while also further building the museum's renowned collection. Before joining the MFA, Yu served as the inaugural director of the Pacific Asia Museum in its incarnation under the auspices of the University of Southern California. And before that, she was the assistant curator of Chinese art at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. Christina was born and raised in China, holds a BA from Wellesley, an MA from Boston University, and a PhD from the University of Chicago. With that, you can see we have a veritable font of information sitting before you, but so I'm going to begin our questioning. And I'd like to actually begin with Jeffrey. Jeffrey, you are an inveterate collector, I think it's fair to say. Starting in the 1980s, you managed to amass world-class collections not only of French drawings, but also Italian drawings. But then in the mid-1990s, you broadened it, as I mentioned, to include Chinese Imperial Cinnabar, and then more recently, in 2008, your eye turned to Japan. Why the shift to Asian art?
Well, essentially the problem is seating 4 chairs in from the left. You raise your hand. That's my wife, Carol. And as she puts it, I'm 2-dimensional, but she's 3-dimensional. Generally, I have had an interest in all sorts of types of art. So the fact that we collect in 3 areas is more a matter of discipline and opportunity than it is that I only like those 3, or that she only likes 2 of the 3. When we started, it was really a matter of thinking about what we could start with, and of course China was the logical subject. So Carol asked me what could we collect, and I said, well, let's go through the list. The problems of jade, even then in the mid-90s, being cut with holographic lasers. Porcelain was expensive the day it came out of the kiln, and relatively easy to fake. Ivory and rhino horn were clearly going to be a problem, etc. So basically we started with the one thing that was too tedious to make to be worth faking, which is carved cinnabar lacquer. So that's how that started. The second wave comes in 2008. Carol's walking from the UN for a conference and sees the window of Beatrice Chang's gallery. Beatrice right there. And becomes enamored of Kanto Sabusa's to Joan Mervis, so she is the second problem here. And that was really how it came about. We do run the collections, though, in an extraordinarily institutional way. They have a long-term public purpose, and both the acquisition and the visibility is really very much informed by that. Carol actually manages herself the Asian collections. I have a curator full-time for French because I actually have a day job.
Before you surrender the mic, so you're in a unique position to compare sort of the Western market and the Asian market. It's a huge question, but can you comment on some differences that you've discovered?
Yes, it's a huge question. First of all, Asian market is not a thing. There's the Chinese market, there's Japanese market, and then there's the occasional other markets. So, for example, Indonesia, it's sort of a good example. Indonesian 20th century and contemporary art market is extraordinarily correlated to the stock market in Indonesia. China is affected by a whole lot of things, but particularly the increase of wealth and the ability of Chinese to get around. Those are the macroeconomic drivers. Japan is sort of a steady state market, but the taste for Japanese has been declining in the West for pretty much everything except contemporary Japanese ceramics, which are really cool. Southeast Asia is just really a spotty backwater. Most of the dealers in Chinese art even gave up dealing with Vietnamese ceramics. Western art markets are far more sophisticated, far more developed, and one of the key differences is simply the distribution system. The distribution system, meaning primarily auction houses and dealers, is vastly more developed, vastly more extensive, and art fairs, although those are proliferating in Asia, but fundamentally it will be decades before Asian markets, which is essentially China by itself, really catch up to that type of dealer and auction distribution system.
Thank you. So Joan, you are a major dealer of Japanese Edo period prints and paintings, as well as contemporary Japanese ceramics, as I mentioned. For many potential collectors, I think that Japan sort of looms large in the imagination since the mid-19th century. And it's also been, of course, a source of inspiration for many Western artists. But it can also seem, I think, consequently intimidating and distant. So what advice would you give to a budding collector who's interested in Japan?
Well, Japanese art in some ways is, I think, more approachable than Chinese art and Indian art, or I'm just highly prejudiced. And maybe we could have the first slide if you could do that. I prepared just a few slides to keep you visually stimulated. I think anyone can look at that slide and see you're looking at a representation of a horse in clay, but you're looking at two works of art that are separated by sort of the history of mankind there. And that is what Japanese art can offer to you at an affordable level that is available on the market today, that is not being exploited by Chinese runners creating an inflationary situation. Part of the problem with Japanese art in terms of acquiring it is where do you find it? And one of the great things is that in March, coming up this week, there are almost a dozen exhibitors for Asia Week that represent every single facet of Japanese art that is currently available on the market at its highest level. We have 7 dealers specializing in ukiyo-e, Japanese prints. We have 6 dealers specializing in Japanese paintings and screens, and another half dozen dealers, partially who overlap with those other 2 fields, who handle sculpture, Buddhist material, and tea ceremony works. The best way to learn and collect any work of art is to see as much as you can, travel as much as you can, go to museums, look, and then go to venues where you can handle the art, talk to those who represent that art, maybe even talk to the artists if the artists are still alive, and become familiar with it both tactily, visually, and intellectually. And in that regard, over time, you will develop an eye and the comfort to have a relationship with those particular experts. Go to the next slide. Oh, that wasn't the first slide. Oops. Could we go backwards? What happened? There we go. Oops. The next slide I'm showing you two amazingly beautiful ukiyo-e Japanese prints. And unlike what Jeffrey said about the market for Asian art, I would argue that the market for ukiyo-e is an international market. There are collectors and dealers on virtually every continent, and it's been broadly collected for 100 plus years, 120, 30 years. So it's a fairly sophisticated, very narrow market with very savvy collectors and museums. But I will tell you, it's actually a good time to buy in that particular field. We're going to have a couple of very great shows coming up in March, because many of the collectors have passing on and retiring from the field, and museums sort of have everything already. I think the Gale collection alone is, I don't know, 1,000
I don't know that the
prints.
curator will ever say that they have everything.
Yeah, but the museums are not as active players as they were in the 1970s, so it's a wonderful time for that field. And the next slide I wanted to show you is what can happen when you have creative curatorial interest and expand the field of vision for the visitors to a museum. Oh, I see, it's running my fast go. Okay, could we go back to the other slide, please? And you have a view of a beautiful life-size cast of a particular artist, Kondo Takahiro, and you see how Matthew has brilliantly installed it in the Buddhist art gallery, not in the clay gallery, not in a Japanese art gallery, but in a rightful point of presence surrounded by Buddhist art masterpieces from all over Asia.
And I have to just throw in that as you're consulting with people, please don't leave out curators. They live to talk to you. You are their tribe, somebody else who's interested in similar material. So please do reach out. Jim, you are a major purveyor of all manner of Chinese art, including ceramics, bronzes, jades, objects from the scholar's desk, and sculpture. What are some of the present opportunities for collecting Chinese art, and would you advise a potential collector to focus on a particular area or play the incredible field of Chinese art?
Well, I think that it is desirable to collect whether you have a strategy first or it develops over time. And there's no need to set up your focus at the instance of starting to have interest in Chinese art. But inevitably, you will need to focus. It's not possible to cover 5,000 years of creation in dozens of different media and have any meaningful grasp of what you're dealing with in the time that's allotted to us on this earth. So that it's important to focus. And I think all of my colleagues here would agree on that. Whatever subject, the more you get into it, the more you get out of it. The process of collecting is a process of finding and selecting and refining. And that in itself demands a focus on what you decided to select out of the market. The market is constantly changing, and as Jeffrey mentioned recently, just a moment ago, the strength of the Chinese economy and the strength of the Chinese buyers has revolutionized the price levels in the Chinese art market in most categories. But even in that kind of situation, it doesn't take a Rothschild to find a beautiful object at a reasonable price. The collecting prices, the prices paid by collectors and museums are driven by many factors: scarcity, beauty, importance in history. But the most important factor determining price is fashion. We could be here 100 years ago and a Chinese art dealer would be telling you that famille noir porcelain of the Kangxi period is the best thing in the world, the best thing China ever did. At that point in time, that was the fashion. Duveen and other dealers had people mesmerized with the idea that if they could only get more famille noir, then their life would be complete. I think we've progressed to learn more and more about Chinese art over the years, and particularly we've learned more and more about China. We've learned how to look at Chinese art in the way that Chinese scholars and Chinese collectors have over the years, over the centuries. I think collecting is more highly developed in China in the early days than anywhere else in the world. And that's why the Emperor Qianlong is the great hero of all Chinese collectors living today. But collectors in China who are paying enormous prices for imperial porcelains with rain marks that document their having been made for the emperor have a good reason to put that at the top of their list. It doesn't necessarily have to be at the top of your list. You could look into, as Jeffrey has, look into lacquer, which is not as spiky or as tremendously expensive in the market today. And there are a tremendous variety of categories. You could select by material, you could select by date, you could select by color, you could select by quality. And the importance of focus will never go away. That's the heart of collecting.
Thank you. Dessa, in addition to private dealers like Jim and Joan, auctions and auction houses have been a key source of material for private collectors. You've been part of the auction world for 40 years, and over that time you've witnessed tremendous proliferation of, I think, auctions worldwide. Even for those of us in the field, it can be intimidating in a trial to keep up with the avalanche of auction catalogs that arrive in my office. So how would you give us insight into your world? How would you recommend that our participants today approach auction houses?
Well, okay, thank you. Well, this appears to be a very well-seasoned crowd for auctions, so what I may be saying, at least at the outset, is rather basic, but for those of you who are going to watch this later who may be new to the process, auction is really one vehicle in which, museum directors or museum curators, dealers, private collectors can buy works of art. And it's the responsibility of established auction houses and their businesses to hire specialists whose job it is to source the best that they can find from private collections, dealers, the occasional museum deaccession, and estates. And what we offer people is the opportunity to actually handle works of art, to come in during previews, to be able to actually handle things that are either modestly priced or up to 7 figures. You look at them, talk to your neighbor about them, talk to your art advisor, talk with the auction house specialist, and get a perspective on where this falls in the realm of your area of interest. We also add a very overt competitive process to art collecting, which is that buyers need to register and they need to bid against each other in an open forum at one place, one time, one moment, in order to get the piece that they actually covet. And that is a sort of a performance art aspect to our business, which makes it very exciting and in some cases very frustrating. How do you select your auction house? Well, I think you look across the field. It's important to buy from auction houses that have established and seasoned specialists in their department. I think they'll give you the best advice. And how do you access it? The internet did not exist when most of us were starting out in the field. And now it provides incredible access for information as to when auctions are occurring, what's in them, what's the content of their catalogs. And through perusing all of this, you can then make your decisions as to whether or not you want to attend an auction, which we all highly advise because there's nothing like handling the object in your hand, or sending a seasoned representative to look for you, and then making your choice and then deciding to bid online. So those are all vehicles through which you can access the market. I do have to say that most auction houses, particularly international auction houses, sell on a regular schedule because they have various sales in multiple departments, and they have to plan their years to meet post-war and contemporary week, or impressionist week, or all of these various fairs that have come together at particular moments. And so if you are interested in finding out when these all occur, you can, buyer beware, sign up to receive notifications from auction houses, which we're very happy to do if you opt in, but you will be inundated with information about when the things that you are interested in come up. But, you know, Asia Week New York 2020 is a big case in point, because there the New York-based auction houses, you know, put together their sales to coincide with dealer exhibitions, with museum events and openings, and create this marvelous opportunity. And this year there are going to be 18 lectures given by people in niche markets throughout New York in that period of time. It's a marvelous opportunity for collectors to come learn and buy, of course, some of the best things that are currently on the market.
Christina, whereas private collectors can follow their hearts and tastes in collecting, the same is not always true for curators and museum directors. Give us some insight into the process and how collecting works within a museum.
Well, first of all, I want to say that actually, this panel will represent very different, represent different aspects and the different sectors of our world, but we all live in the same ecosystem, and we all support each other, right? Museums represents, in a way, non-profit sector, but we also work with dealers, with collectors, and with auction houses and scholars, and I think we actually, in a way, all supporting each other. In terms of collecting in a museum, I think we normally start probably from two places. First of all, we start from what we have already, and that of course varies from museums to museums. And I see increasingly more and more where museums, when we talk about new acquisitions, we also think about who are our audiences. And that's probably something I will see play an increasingly bigger role. So first of all, if we go back to see what we have already, and there are a lot of talks in museums about collecting the gaps. So basically meaning we try to understand what we have already, and especially for museums like you and me, where we call ourselves encyclopedic museums, so we also try to present an encyclopedic collection to our visitors. So basically we identify what we have already, and then that helps us to understand what we do not have, or what are the areas that we have, but we'd like to increase the quality. So those are probably, I would say, where museums would look first when we look for pieces for acquisition. And another big part is really the audience. And that's actually a little bit similar to what Jim was saying earlier, that audience is changing. Probably if we look at the private sectors, the taste is changing, but I think in the museum sector it's more like the expectation of our audiences are changing. So when we collect new pieces, we also try to imagine if this piece comes to the museum, how we can display it, in which room, together with with which pieces, and also what are the stories, and if there are new stories we can tell. So I think that's probably in a way, the main difference between how a museum collects and how private collectors collect.
Jeffrey, in addition to being a formidable collector yourself, you're also lectured about collecting art as an investment vehicle and at investment conferences. What advice would you offer to collectors who are worried about their art purchases diminishing in value over time?
My best advice is just don't collect at them. I wanted to do an entire lengthy lecture about the change of taste over time in multiple fields. I have done talks, including at the Federal Reserve in Boston, to primarily economists who were shocked to understand how the art market worked. So to understand about the subject is actually quite complicated because taste changes. So furniture that was valuable, American 18th century furniture, English 18th century furniture, known in the trade as brown furniture, has become virtually unsaleable except for the most fabulous pieces, which is very rarefied. But if you think about this from an investment point of view, the real central problem in the short and intermediate term is transaction costs, which have converged more or less to similarity in the auction markets as proxy. So you can consign to a dealer if you want to sell, but they have a lower commission rate often, but they have a much narrower field of potential clients. The auction houses have a higher commission rate, but a very wide range of clients. But here's the basic math. If you're basically a retail customer selling one or two things periodically, the seller's commission is about 10% plus various cataloging costs that show up late in the contract as you get to it. The buyer's commission is 25% up to various numbers, now up to about 200,000 or more. So what that does is, it means that of the gross, it's a huge middleman take. And what I told the economist at the Fed was that if the stock market had transaction costs like this, there'd be no trades. That's only the buy side. If you're thinking you're investing in it, you have to buy it and you have to sell it. Then comes if you have a profit. The actual tax law is that if you're just a collector with no investment purpose, any gain is at the ordinary income rates, but cannot be offset by any losses. If you're deemed to be an investor, and it's a sort of vague and complicated topic, then you can offset it, but the long-term capital gain rate, unbeknownst to even sophisticated collectors, is 28%, not the 20% plus the 3.8% Medicare surcharge. So if you're a dealer, you can offset all your expenses, but your sales are all ordinary income offsetting that. And if you have dealer inventory, you can't donate for any more than your cost. So if you're getting the picture now that the round-trip transaction costs are so large that it takes an extraordinary run-up in market value just to break even, or you have to hold for a very, very long period of time, which does sometimes work. And you have to be sensitive to the vagaries of taste. So whereas people used to furnish their homes in 18th century French, in the 1950s that was the hottest style, now mid-century modern. 50 years from now, I can guarantee you, it won't be mid-century modern. So you really have to be in the market constantly to stay up with these changes of taste and understand that your net actually is going to be much less than you might think. On the other hand, things like we collect the Japanese contemporary ceramics are so inexpensive by art market standards that you get a lot of pleasure for what you spend. Old master drawings to some extent are like that too. Not at the very high end of the market, but pretty much the middle and below. So you can buy really wonderful things, even Vietnamese ceramics. Wonderful things, not a lot of money, as to not losing or making any money, forget about it.
The intangible pleasure of it all. So Joan, with the bursting of the Japanese economic bubble in early 1990s, I think the Japanese art market cooled considerably. The top things still go into the stratosphere, but everything else slowed down, I think it's fair to say. What are some of the opportunities that you touched on it a little bit earlier, but what are some of the opportunities that you see now?
Well, if we could have the next slide. So, just to preface what Jeffrey just said, I was talking to a colleague of mine who was a renowned folk art dealer, a renowned folk art dealer. I won't mention his name, and he used to be a neighbor of mine at this fair. And he used to steadily, year after year, have $1.5 million worth of sales, $2 million at this fair in the 1990s. He said if he had one of those great booths and had a booth at this fair today with the exact same goods, he'd be lucky to get $150,000 for the $2 million worth of goods. His market is so disastrous that he's left it all together, and very few exhibitors in the fair. Fair used to be 1/3 Americana, and we're down to a small percentage. Taste changes. But I would argue Japanese art was never the hottest thing, so therefore therefore it's less subject to the vagaries of taste than some of these other markets. However, there has been change. If we could go back to the slide before this, I give you one example is the area of Zengo, which of course Matthew knows lots about with his PhD subject. But when in the 1980s, 1990s, paintings such as this by a 16th century painting like this would have sold for $40,000, $50,000, and a wonderful painting by an artist named Hakuin might sell for $250,000. Now I almost can't sell them. There's almost no one interested. So if you look at the next slide, you'll see a painting by the artist Baitsu, a later artist in the Literati tradition, and a painting in the Rinpa tradition by Hochu. And you see that those paintings were acquired by small museums. For me, in the old days, I would sell 30 to 40 paintings in a year. Now, if I could sell 3 a year, I'm ecstatic. And my clientele is strictly small museums. Well, actually, you guys bought one, but the major museums are not, they don't need me anymore. Most of the major prominent American collectors who were pioneers in the area of Japanese painting have passed on, have retired, have donated their collections, or partially sold their collections. Mary Burke, Joe Price, the list is huge. The Feinbergs, by the way, the Feinbergs, if you want to see great Japanese painting, opening in 2 weeks, there's a wonderful show of their painting collection at Harvard University, which is the beneficiary of their collection. There's ample room for seeing great Japanese paintings, but there is also ample room for acquisition at a fraction of the price of the Japanese bulk. And could I have the next slide? Screens are another bargain in a certain sense. Here you're looking at something that's 24 feet of art by an artist, Hashimoto Gaho, one of the major painters working in Japan at the turn of the 19th, 20th century. And you're looking at something that sort of doesn't exist in Western art. And I've been to Japanese auctions, dealers' auctions, where I've seen screens purchased for the mouse by, let's say, B- level artists, C+ level artists, perfectly good Japanese paintings, and they're only being purchased for the lacquer mount and the brocade. So even if you have a modicum of money, and let's say you want a pair of screens by an artist, let's say by Ippo or a mid-19th century painter, you can buy a pair of screens for $10,000 or $15,000 that would have been $250,000 not so long ago. Japanese painting is maybe the best bargain out there. I don't know if my colleagues would agree, in the Asian art market today.
Part of the reason I think for the decreasing value of screens, or at least the lowering of the prices, as Japanese move from traditional homes into tiny apartments, there's no place for these works of art. It's a problem. So Jim, part of the art of collecting in any field has to do with connoisseurship, and or that is being able to discern a great work of art from a mediocre one, or an authentic work of art from a spurious one. I think that I think this particularly fraught area of discussion in Chinese art, but how might someone who's interested in Chinese antiquities think about the risk of acquiring marginal or even spurious objects?
Well, there's no doubt that there is a long tradition in China of copying works of art over time, and there's even more activity in any market when the prices go up dramatically, as they have in the last 20, 30 years. And discerning the difference between the real and the fake is really the heart of collecting. It's really the centerpiece of what needs to be taken on as a challenge and enjoyed as a challenge. And there is no magic wand, there's no formula for it except delving into it as deeply as you can. And as Dessa mentioned a while ago, going directly to the work of art. It's wonderful to have the books that we have, the slides that we have, and the ability to go to great museums and press our noses against the glass and see how it looks, and that's an important part of the process. But it's crucial to go to see the best works of art you can that you're able to handle. And I think for that, the auction is a blessing, the auction system, because you can go to a viewing and handle the pieces one by one, take your time, and they're doing it 24 hours a day. You have a regular life or activity, a job that you attend to. These people are doing it 24/7. And to develop a good relationship with a serious dealer who is simpatico to your collecting style, your collecting category, is a great, great thing to get you started in the right direction. Also, as Matthew has mentioned, and Christina has mentioned, museum curators are willing and able to do what they can to help you in the collecting field. I know that one of the finest collections of Chinese art in America is in the Minneapolis Art Institute, and there was a great collection began to form early in the 20th century. They have the bronzes from the Pillsbury collection. But in more recent times, one of the finest collectors in Minneapolis was a man named Bruce Dayton, who, having collected French paintings and French sculpture and things, and donated many things to the museum over the years, went to Basel to see Eiler, one of the great dealers in Basel, to say it's a great anniversary coming up for the museum, and I'd like to buy them something very special. And I've got $2 million to spend. And Mr. Binder said, "Oh, you want a small drawing?" And Bruce said, "No, let me think about it." And he went to London, started looking around for other categories. He ran into a man named Nick Gridley, who was a dealer in Chinese furniture, who introduced him to a whole new world at just the right moment when there was Chinese furniture coming out of China and new scholarship coming along. And he tapped, by the good fortune, he tapped a man who'd spent years studying furniture of all kinds, but also focusing on Chinese furniture, and nobody else was. And he took that $2 million and bought 8 pieces of furniture instead of a single small drawing. And it launched him as a Chinese art collector. And in cooperation with the curator of Chinese art at the time in Minneapolis, and the cooperation of others around, he was just a wonderful man to deal with. And he did what every collector should do. It's not so easy to do. You set aside a pile of money and you say, that I can afford to spend. And then that's the only mathematics you have to do. You then go on and buy with your heart. But if you can buy with your heart with a little voice over your shoulder saying, no, you can get a better one. Oh, wait, don't you know it's restored? That's even better. And that's why you need a good relationship with someone who is on your wavelength, that you can have a dialogue with. And I think that's the best way to go.
Thank you. You know, I can't emphasize enough the willingness of curators to talk to you, but you should know too that, curators devote themselves to this material 24/7. They also don't know everything. And trust me, when they're considering a work of art, they reach out to everyone that they know, in order to make sure that they're getting quality material. So don't be shy. We're here to help. Christina, in the museum world, perhaps even more so than among private collectors, is an increasing emphasis on provenance, the thorny issue of provenance, especially to align with the recommended guidelines of the American Association of Museum Directors. What advice would you offer to our audience today about provenance considerations?
It is
Huge, sorry.
Huge and thorny topic, and also I think there is a certain degrees of variance of practices out there. Even in the museum world, some museums are more strict than others. So I would say, for example, the museum I work at, the museum takes a huge pride in the fact that we are among the most difficult museum to work with in terms of provenance. But from the curator's point of view, sometimes we do feel like, we wish the policy is not as strict. But putting that aside, I think for the audience in this room, probably when you collect, well, first of course, we do not want to encourage any new looting or illegal digging. So, that's something to be aware of. But if you know certain pieces have, a good provenance, that you, well, first of all, as you're conscientious, of course, this is the right thing to do. But at the same time, think of eventually where you would like that piece to go to that you're collecting today. If you are thinking eventually, 30, 40 years down the road, I really like to see this piece in the museum, I would like to donate it to the museum, then you need to be very careful, and even at the very beginning of this stage of your collecting, asking a lot of questions. All the dealers are actually very open and willing to share their source of information. And then if that's your end purpose, to giving certain pieces to the museum, then probably you will need to exercise strict rules and policies as we do. But if that is not, at least now, that is not your purpose, and probably I think there are certain degrees of freedom that you can exercise.
It's also worth keeping abreast of changes and recommendations from the American Association of Art Museum Directors. You can visit their website, and they do update their stance on this issue. In 2013, for example, they established, I think in 2006 or 2008, the Bright Line of 1970. So archaeological material would need to be out of the course of the country of origin by 1970, at the occasion of the UNESCO agreement, or exported legally after that with proper documentation. But in 2008, 2013, they revisited that guideline. And if there's a paperwork trail, for example, where an object had been previously promised to a museum and it was documented, it can now enter the collection according to those recommendations. And right now, the directors are meeting, you can tell this is near and dear to my heart, the directors are meeting in Atlanta for their annual meeting, and they're taking up the issue of orphaned objects, that is, objects that don't have provenance, but on the other hand have not been claimed. They can't enter museums. People don't know what to do with them, but they're considering this in a special category of unaccessioned objects that can enter museums' collection while further research is done to discover the provenance. So some opening of the doorway to deal with this tremendous number of orphaned objects, so-called orphaned objects. So Dessa, in the last 10 years, we've seen unprecedented growth and dominance of Chinese buyers in the Asian art market. What advice could you give new collectors who want to participate but feel they don't have a chance to create a good collection amid such steep competition?
Well, if you are a new collector and your immediate goal is to buy the greatest Qianlong Marken period imperial piece of porcelain, then you have to first have a giant pocketbook, and you would be wise to have a good series of seasoned advisors to help you, and then you may not be successful, as Jim has said. However, China has a long, lively, and sophisticated history of collecting and revering their own art. And so you have seen this dominance over the last 10 years when travel, when you have seen this rise of millionaires and billionaires, and also the loosening of travel restrictions, where Chinese buyers are dominating the market in these important areas to them that are hot on the current market. However, most new collectors don't have such lofty ambitions when they start out, and there are incredible opportunities really to buy in the area of Chinese art. According to recent sources, Chinese art has the biggest volume of works of art in the world on the market. And so if you look at this and you get good advice, there are many, many opportunities to be able to sit down and figure out what you like, get good advice, train yourself, educate yourself, both intellectually, yes, but through hands-on, handling of the works of art that you think you want to own. Also looking for opportunities to buy, and then buying what you like and the best that you can of that particular category that you can afford. And that is really what makes a enjoyable collecting experience for you as collectors and for for us, those people who are trying to advise you. And as many of us have said here already, you have to keep in mind that markets fluctuate. I think all of us here over the decades have seen the rise and fall of certain areas of collecting. Jones referred to the Japanese art market. Through, these fluctuations occur because the market's driven by certain collectors who are after a particular piece, socio-political, economic conditions, and things that were hot. 10 years ago, 5 years ago, even last year, or momentarily, become, the market cools off. And then there are opportunities, if you're vigilant, or if you have someone who can advise you to be vigilant, or is vigilant, for you, to take advantage of opportunities to buy. As Jonas referred to, the Japanese art market presents many opportunities for buying in the area of, classical, modern, contemporary ceramics, bronzes, paintings, sculpture, etc., as do aspects of Indian, Himalayan, and Southeast Asian art. It's just a matter of taking the time, being focused, and educating yourself.
On that note, Jeffrey. Yeah.
I'd like to have something maybe in a different way to explain the theme that I sort of hear going through this in a different way. America's not unique in this, but a little bit unusual in how extreme Americans view almost anything through the eyes of money. Quality equates to money. Status equates to money. Intelligence equates to money. Everything, more or less, equates to money. That's not true in every single place in the world. Likewise, in collecting, you could think of this very differently. How many of you like to drink wine? Raise your hands. Not as many as I thought. Anyway, I'll use the analogy anyhow. You got to dinner to a good restaurant in New York. Mid-price bottle of wine now is what, about $150. So you drink the $150 bottle of wine, and you can enjoy it over 2 hours, and by the third hour it becomes uric acid. If you buy a piece of art, you can enjoy it as long as you own it, every single day. So if you look at your hourly, the cost per hour of pleasure, in that way, it's actually quite low. And because price and quality don't necessarily have much to do with each other at all. When I was a young dealer, I wouldn't even let my clients buy Picasso Musketeer paintings that are now $10, $12, $15 million each. We had a situation at the MFA years ago. I was on the collections committee. Curator brought in a Celadon piece of Vietnamese ceramics. It was about, let's say, $6,000. Collections committee was having a hard time because, one, they had another Celadon piece, and how good could it be at $6,000? I had to intercede to say, one, this is 200 years earlier, and this is one of the best pieces of Vietnamese Celadon ceramics you're going to see. The price and quality have nothing to do with another. Think of collecting as what you can afford. You don't have to buy the best, meaning the best in the world. How much pleasure are you going to get out of it, and what's your hourly cost?
Thank you. Jim, over the course of your career, both within the auction world and as a private dealer, you've come into contact with lots of personality types. So even for the most, I'd say, secretive collector, there's an element of social interaction as they search for objects, interaction with dealers or auction representatives and advisors and so on. What insight can you give us into how collectors can cultivate and maintain the most fruitful relationships with their contacts within the market?
Is how to behave in the ecosystem. The fact is, you're quite right, Matthew, it's a social activity. Collecting is a social activity. A great deal of the joy of collecting is sharing with your friends your collection. You show me yours, I'll show you mine. And also, gossip is the second most important product of the art market. But in fact, it's vital gossip because it's knowledge sometimes is the key to a successful approach to the collecting field. And the best kind of collector from a a dealer or a museum's point of view, is a collector who's discreet and knows when to talk and when not to talk, and knows when you are told something in confidence is not to be passed along lightly. Because knowing something that the rest of the crowd doesn't know can make a big difference in your opportunities. Whether it's an opportunity to find something and consider it, or an opportunity to buy something at a preferential price. And a dealer always is going to hope to find that kind of collector who is ready to get into a dialogue and ready to not get into spreading that information as soon as he leaves the room. Because if I want that dealer to show me the best things first, then I have to know his position. He's saying, I've got only one of these, and I want to sell it, and I know the art market loves to gossip. If you're the first person to shade it, then you take a different attitude than if you know that it's already been refused by your friend down the road. The object doesn't change, but your attitude changes. And there's a lot of psychology, I don't have to tell you that, in the art market. So discretion is important, whether you're talking to a dealer or a museum curator, perhaps even more so as a museum curator who is giving you information that is something that is important to him or her, but is not something that you can take to the bank, because they're not in the business of advising you on prices. They're talking about the history or the quality or the importance of that work of art. And that's something which, again, is a matter of opinion, but if it becomes something that you're going to be repeatedly going back to that curator, then you have to know it's a two-way street. They have a right to expect some contribution on your side, whether it's monetary or works of art, or remember me in your will. So that it's a social exchange. And collecting thrives when you get collectors together. And although we've heard all this afternoon about the fact that there are more and more people collecting Chinese art coming in from China with great resources, that is both a blessing and a curse. It's a curse because the man beside you may have more money and may outbid you, but it's a blessing because the rising prices bring more and more material on the market. We've never had more material coming out available to collectors and museums than we do now. Entire categories. I mean, who did you know that was collecting bamboo carvings in 1960? Who did you know that was collecting signed works of art by imperial jade workers in the 1960s? Well, I know James Watt was doing both of those, and he could do it for pennies in Hong Kong, and he knew how to do it. And his knowledge is so crucial to a number of collections in America. And that is something that you can have the joy of participating in. Just as Jeffrey said, count how many hours you've had. The fun of it is just as important as the beauty and value of the work of art.
Thank you. Joan, you count collectors and museums among your client list, but you also maintain, I think, really excellent relationships with living artists. Talk to us a little bit about that dynamic.
With pleasure. That's the fun part. Could I have the next slide, please? Sometimes I have a large number of artists with whom I work, and question related to that is how do I find them first before I introduce them to my clients. So this is a fun story. Sakiyama Takayuki, and those of you who know me know I've been representing his work for over 20 years. But how I found him was total serendipity. Sometimes you're in the right place at the right time. And I was with my husband Bob, who's seated here tonight, killing time to go to a movie. And I went into a small shop in Ginza, and there was ceramic plates that looked interesting, and I had a conversation with him. I'm not interested in plates, but do you do anything large? And he showed me some pictures, and I looked at these pictures, and the stuff looked great. And so Bob and I went traipsing off 4 hours away from Tokyo, and we literally took out a hose and we started cleaning off the works that were in the backyard, because he had no room for these works in his home, and cleaning out birds' nests and the cat who was living in one of them. And she just left, and the first piece that was acquired by Amy Poster, who was sitting here, who was the curator of Asian art at the Brooklyn Museum. The second piece, if we can go back again to that slide, was a sort of, this piece was acquired by the Metropolitan Museum, but it was acquired also in a very circuitous way. Yeko Morase came to my home to look at things when she was a consultant to the Met. She was my former professor at Columbia, and I was showing her some screens and paintings, and I wasn't up to her level at that moment in time. And she's looking at this pot that's sitting next to it, and she says, "That's great, I love that. I have to have it for the Met. How much is it?" And I said, "It's $4." She said, "I'll get back to you. I'll get Mary Burke to buy it for us. Don't worry, don't sell it." And within 2 days she came back and she said, "I got the money. I'll send you the $40,000 right away." I said, "No, $4,000, not $40,000. And so of course it ended up at the Met, and the next Mary Burke exhibition of beautiful Buddhist sculpture, ancient ceramics, Japanese paintings, Japanese screens, the design department at the museum decided that the poster should be this Sakiyama Takayuki pot for that exhibition. And the fun part was that Mr. Sakiyama came to New York with his mother, who was in a wheelchair, and we had to pose in front of every poster with his pot, in the elevator, at the escalator, all over the museum, so that they could revel in the joy of seeing his work not only displayed in the museum, but being considered a work of equal caliber to these other important ancient, or what people might have called fine art. Can we see the next slide? A similar story was my experience, and the Horvitzes were with me, when we were traveling as part of a tour. One way that I've introduced a select number of collectors to the wonders of Japanese contemporary clay is bringing them to the clay itself and encountering the artists and meeting them, which brings a different level of understanding and camaraderie, and even just that wonderful memory of the time and place of being with the artist. In the case of this young artist, which now you're seeing one of her works in the Horvitz's home on the top left. We were in the town of Hagi, which is a part of Japan on the backside of the main island of Honshu facing Korea. And we were at the museum, and the director said it was taking us around. "Oh, we have this show by this new young woman, and she won a prize, so the prize is the show." So the doors are, and he was indifferent. He sort of shrugged and hoped we didn't mind. We opened the doors, and all of us, collectively, it was an oh my God moment, and women, American women screaming at the top of their voice, "Is it for sale? Can I get it? Can I buy it?" And it was one of those eureka moments that's very exciting for that museum director, for the artist who we then met later, and we were able to buy half of that show. And thanks to the Horvitz's generosity, many of those pieces are now in the collections of American museums. And this piece that you were seeing before had pride of place on the balcony at the Metropolitan Museum for the moment John Carpenter put it there. And I can't tell you how many times in a week we get an email from some person unknown who took a picture of that piece and now wants to buy one, and they plug in her name under Fujikasa, and out comes my name, and they want one, and they can't have one. Her work is very painfully slowly created.
Yeah, thank you. We've reached the end of our formal sort of questioning, or my questioning, but I wanted to open the floor up for your questions. So I think that, well, absolutely.
I'd like to just tie again, think briefly from Joan and from Jim about collecting. When I was a young dealer, I came up with a simple way to think about what to buy. Not simple in implementation, conceptually. Probably many of you had basic set theory in junior high school, middle school. The circles, so the set of something is depicted by a circle. So imagine that this is what I told my client, and we still do this today. Imagine the set of all the things that you like. Imagine another circle, all the things that are priced okay. Imagine a third circle, all the things that connoisseurs, experts, etc. think are very good. By the intersection of those three sets. The second, it's very simple. If you always use that discipline, you're not going to go far off. Sort of the backup to, or the way to get there is another set of three things. LRT. Look, read, and talk. Look at as much as you can. There's a type of cognitive exercise that develops your eye I think it's true. My academic background 4 years ago was actually graduate study in psychology. That you practice looking by looking a lot. And it sort of develops what's in your visual memory. 2, read. Read as much as you can. If you can read in Chinese or Japanese, that's great, but there is material in English, French, etc. 3rd, talk. Talk to who? Talk to dealers, talk to other collectors. One way to tell a good dealer is how much they're just happy to talk to you about what they have. If they really are transactional only, they aren't going to want to spend a lot of time. That's not a bad culling exercise. You do those 3 things, the Venn diagram and LRT. May go wrong in individual things, but I think your collecting will be much more logical and much more pleasurable.
Thank you. Questions? And I think that we have a mic. If you wait for the mic, that would be great. Really? We've covered everything? We don't.
Somebody suggested to some of my relatives many years ago that works of art that leave Japan are no longer desirable to Japanese collectors. Is that true?
Nope. I think some of the highest prices ever paid for Japanese art have been at auctions here in New York and by Japanese buyers. Fair?
Maybe you're referring to like Japanese prints that were exported from Japan in the mid-19th century by the bushelful and not respected as fine art. And only in the 1980s, when prices became much more augmented, were they then alluring to Japanese buyers.
I think there's also the case of it's the reverse of actually what you're suggesting. There's a certain credibility when Japanese art has been recognized by Westerners that it becomes popular in Japan. It was true with ukiyo-e prints and paintings, but certainly true with contemporary ceramics.
What is the current position of museums in the acquisition or acceptance of donations of objects made of ivory?
Yeah, hugely problematic, actually. It's not that we can't acquire them, but it's, again, the paper trail is very important to establish that it's historic ivory and that, no animals have been harmed in contemporary art.
Yeah, absolutely. Just adding to that, there is absolutely no say anything ivory that we cannot accept, but the challenge is to establish and convincing the authority that these are ancient ivory. These are not new approached ivory. And how to establish that, especially if the collection is older, there's no import-export paper trail, then that is actually the challenge.
And the law goes even beyond the object. It has to be examined to make sure that it's never been repaired with contemporary ivory as well. Sir?
I guess this question goes to Jim. How has the recent back and forth about trade issues between the Trump administration and China and back and forth, how has that affected import-export of Chinese art, or has it affected it?
Yes, it has affected it. What is being referred to here is the brilliant idea from the administration now in the White House that by somehow raising tariffs on everything in China will have a great change in the trade relationship. So far we're still waiting for the second shoe to fall, but what has happened is that the instructions were given to the U.S. Trade Representative to raise tariffs on everything, anything that begins with the letter C. And so the first time around, they acknowledged the fact that it made no sense to tariff ancient or just antique works of art. They were not damaging any that wasn't good enough for the dollar. Now they had the next day round, the next round, they put them on the list, and now there's a 15% import duty on any Chinese object, whether it's antique or ancient or not. And all of the works of art from all other countries in the world enter the United States free of any tariff. But by adding this tariff, what has happened is that it stops people who are in America from having access to the international market. And that undermines the plans of some people who had already bought things, or whether they had or not, or they just had it in their house in London and wanted to bring it back. It doesn't matter. The fact that the object is being imported from Paris or London or Tokyo, it simply stops the business dead in its tracks. And people say, well, I'll tuck it away and hope that sanity returns one of these days. But at the moment, it's a very quiet time in Chinese art because of the difficulties that they're encountering in the demonstrations in Hong Kong and the restrictions on capital being taken out of China. All of these factors have changed the market to hit the pause button right about now, which is unfortunate for me, but could be a good moment for a collector, could be a good moment for someone in America who doesn't want to walk away simply because it's become more and more difficult, more and more hurdles put in its way. And we don't know when, if ever, that tariff will go away. People assume it'll go away when they settle the next round of talks with China. It's possible that it will be cut in half in the next month or two under talks, but I've not heard anyone talk about eliminating it. And it is a very damaging factor for museums and collectors. You might see something coming up at Hotel Drouot in Paris. You have to add on 15%. That's a whopping big addition. It puts you behind the eight ball with everybody else in the market having a 15% advantage on you. So it's a damaging moment for us.
Maybe one more question? Down here in front.
I think it's a point you mentioned about the changes, the taste for Asian art has changed over time. So could you maybe elaborate a little bit more about that? Like, what exact changes have you seen over the last, say, 10, 20 years? Does it have anything to do with the digital revolution that we are experiencing? And do you have any predictions, for the next 10, 20 years? Second question is, in order for an object to be sellable, do you have to buy it from auction houses, galleries, or reputable dealers? Or for example, let's say if I go to an antique store, a local antique store, and I buy something, will I be able to sell it, in the future? Is there anything that I need, to show proof of, I don't know, certificate of authenticity or something to sell it?
Good
Thank you.
questions. Anyone?
Well, I would say that on your second point, first of all, which is, if you buy something from a local antique store, can you then sell it? It totally depends on what you've purchased. We always like to use the 4 thoughts of quality, condition, rarity, and provenance as a guide for collecting and also for selling, at least not only at auction, but I would admit for, say for collecting, private collectors and dealers as well. But if you have a good object, and it does not have provenance, then it comes up to how good is it, is it a desirable object, et cetera, et cetera. And I think auction houses and dealers sell things without provenance if they meet certain market criteria. So, a lot of art doesn't have that documentation. On the first part of what trends, I think we've just all seen so many that, the 80s were the period where Japan was, #1. And then we saw this change in the early 90s. You saw a big Tan Sansai market. There was a shift there. There are just so many shifts, and I would say that social media and the internet has speeded up the market. It really has. It's, you used to be able to put out information on an object 6 or 8 weeks before an auction, and interest would continue to build on an object. Now, you have to be more strategic, because it could become yesterday's news immediately, depending if someone else eclipses it. So social media and the internet have changed market taste. They've exposed the market to so many now factors. One thing I wanted to point out about social media and the internet is, there are a lot of opportunities and, encouragement to collectors to go on chat rooms and find out information on the internet. Please, always, it comes down to consider the source. Consider whether or not the information that you're getting has basis in fact. Because there is great information out there, and there's a lot of disinformation. So it all comes back to being, doing your due diligence when you read about, information that you see that's not been vetted.
The same is true for purchasing on the internet.
That's right.
Photography can make every object look fabulous, so it's really necessary to see it in person. I think it's also true that the market has often followed the economy. So during Japan's bubble economy, Japanese art, it's no surprise, reached very high heights. With the Chinese economy coming up, the first object I bid at an auction as a young curator in 1990 was a Korean 18th century lacquer box. And the top end of the estimate was $15,000. I was very proud that my director approved me up to $18,000, and it sold for $500,000. So clearly the Korean economy was moving along. So it often is related to that. But even within an economic boom, there are areas that might not nationalistically be of interest to collectors. So I think now, I think it's probably true, Jim can agree or disagree, but early on, Chinese collectors were not so interested in Ming-Chi tomb material. They were interested in Qing and Ming porcelain, for example. Now I think they're interested in everything, and at least for a long time, they were not interested in archaeological material.
I would strongly recommend you not depend on the relationship between macroeconomic conditions and the behavior of the art market. I started as a young dealer just at the time of the oil embargo in the 1970s, which brought the art market to a screeching total halt worldwide for a variety of reasons. The last big recession, there was a sort of flight to safety, and it was perceived that art was maybe a good bet. These things don't have close relations, and if you think of, well, you wouldn't necessarily know this, but gold is actually not correlated with inflation exactly. What gold is partially correlated to is supply and demand. Like when India is booming, India consumes an enormous amount in jewelry. So it's a supply-demand function. But what it responds to as to inflation is not inflation, but panic due to unexpected acute inflation. It is otherwise not correlated with inflation. So I wouldn't think about, well, an economy is growing a lot or not growing a lot. There's many other complicated interacting factors, and I would go back to how much pleasure do you get per hour for the dollars you spend?
Thank you. I think our time is up. Thank you all for coming to